With that, we're going to go ahead and invite forward our candidates for Congressional U.S. Congress District 2. Am I right? One. Excuse me. Sorry. Yes. There's a lot of numbers floating around up here. Dr. Jennifer Zimmerman and Phil Ayer, come forward.
Very strict about here.
Okay for everybody.
Congressional District 1.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Yes. Okay, well, welcome. We're glad you're both here. We're glad all of you are here, and we're ready to get started. So again, just a reminder that opening question and intro, in 90 seconds, and we'll start with Dr. Zimmerman first, but let's say in 90 seconds, please state your name, the office you are seeking, and then answer the following question. What do you think are the most important solutions at the federal level to address sea level rise and flooding?
So good evening, So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy birthday, Allie. My name is Jennifer Zimmerman. I am running for the U.S. House of Representatives in Florida District 1. Now, obviously, this is a topic that should really reverberate to all of us. Now, I am a woman of science. I am a pediatrician. I'm still actively practicing. So if I'm a little hard of hearing, it's because 30 children a day screaming in your ears. When you give them their shots for their physicals, it takes a toll on you. But nevertheless, this is so important that I am here to discuss about what I feel we should do. Remember, this problem, as a physician, I am science-oriented. Before we can implement changes or before we can implement any kind of projects that would help, we need to know why, the root cause analysis of why we even have sea level rise. And of course, we all know those causes, and if we know them, we can implement the changes. So for example, if there are added water from melting ice sheets and glaciers, we all know what's happening with our ice sheets. It's causing the global increase in sea level. Expansion of seawater as it warms. As we very well know, anything that's warm, that's why we stop, drop, and roll, is because heat rises. And like a thermometer, if the heat rises when you measure your child's temperature, you see that red mark going up. That's how you know how high the fever is. Number 3, there is a slowing of the Gulf Stream all over the world. And number 4, we do have sinking land. Florida and Norfolk and all of those places are unfortunately part of those. So at the federal level, I think the most important thing is when we identify all these that cause sea level rise, we must implement changes that will help prevent the water from encroaching into our territory, because this will also affect our national security. I don't know if you're aware that there are at least 18 bases along the coast, and we have one, and we have several over here in our state. And yes, sir. Okay. So remember, there are plenty of ways we can do to protect our beaches. our coastlines from sea level rise.
Can you give me the restate?
Yes.
Sure. So in 90 seconds, please state your name, the office you are seeking, and then answer the following question. What do you think are the most important solutions at the federal level to address sea level rise and flooding?
Good afternoon. My name is Phil Ayer. I'm a Democratic candidate for Congress of the United States from House District 1. That's Walton County and Holmes County and all points west of the Alabama border. In dealing with the complex subject of sea rise, you need to, in the public policy arena, I would look at it in the prism of three areas: science, education, and action. Science, make sure we know the data that's around, so we turn on and keep on, turn back on EPA data, continue and expand NOAA data, and expand other measurements of the entire system that causes the sea to rise. We need to take a look at the gases and the ice melts, and really have a solid area of publicly available data that is unencumbered by political agendas. In the education realm, we need to make sure that we communicate that data in a way that is nonpartisan and cold, hard facts, and educate the people along and not allow ideology to swipe it away or narrow special interest to cause the whole education process to come to a grinding halt. And then with respect to action, it's join the climate change again, it's deal with carbon taxes, and to build different and alternative forms of energy. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. One of the things I failed to mention before is that there is one microphone, so when there's two candidates up front here, we ask them to share, and they've done a very nice job of that. You know, part of being elected official is bringing people together, and so that's a good sign. If you could pass that test, so thank you. You're welcome to either pass it back and forth or to set it down as you did, so that's just fine. So we're going to go ahead and begin a series of questions that will go to each of the candidates, and these we have just 1 minute for, not the minute and a half as we had before. And remember, Mary's over here. You can always look toward her if you need to see how much time you have left. So we'll begin with Phil Ayer on this one, and we'll switch back and forth. But according to flood IQ data, sea level rise plus a Category 3 hurricane would cause flooding-related damage in over 1.6 million homes in Florida this year. What can we do now to protect these areas?
Well, what we can do now is to prepare. So make sure it's prepared on an individual level, and prepare our emergency responses, and take the lessons learned from previous hurricanes. So we've got, again, back to the education about what it takes to go through a hurricane. Actually, let's avoid it first. So if you're in the danger zone, you get out, and you have your property protected as much as possible. You have the local governments be prepared to, and the state government be prepared to do better than they did last time, because we can always learn. It's always a lessons learned process. Sometimes there's lessons identified and not lessons learned, but we're doing pretty well in Florida, except for maybe some nursing home situations that were just horrendous. But we should be able to keep learning those lessons and do better. So at the federal level, make sure there's funding for FEMA.
Can I just speak without a microphone? I think it's... Can you hear me?
Oh,
yeah. Theater, okay. Actually, I'll start my answer by, on a federal level, the most important thing we can do for prevention is actually support the local infrastructure. And this has been proven already, like in Miami, Broward County, all those southern areas that have already experienced this. So for example, some areas have built seawalls. They've already started raising the roads or the infrastructure. The zoning that we have, or the codes for the houses that are being built, they're built on stilts. You build your HVAC systems, and all of those things must be above ground at a certain level. If the zoning is standard, we don't have to worry about all this damage that will be incurred later on that costs more billions of dollars in repair rather than prevention. Remember, an ounce of prevention is a lot better than a pound of cure. We can build stormwater pumps, upgrade sewage systems, actually make sure our natural mangroves and oyster reefs and marsh and seagrass habitats are built up.
Thank you. And we'll stay with Dr. Zimmerman for this next question, and then it'll go to Phil Ayer. Under what conditions do you feel it is appropriate to use tax dollars to fund sea level rise resilience activities? And what efforts, if any, would you champion in Congress to fund sea level rise and flooding resilience efforts?
Well, just as I mentioned, all these things that are preventive must have federal funding, because not all areas have the capacity to build all this infrastructure just based on state and local taxes. We all need federal funding to make sure that what we build up is up to code. Because as I said, and that film appropriately states, for every dollar that you spend now in prevention, you're saving $7 in trying to catch up and prevent. And if you've ever been here during the hurricanes, you do know that most businesses have a hard time recovering after a major catastrophe like the hurricanes. The FEMA programs must be, I'm for using the taxpayers' money through FEMA to make sure that your homes are upgraded. I, for one, was a recipient of Northwest Florida Rebuild, and I can tell you that my house is up to code, thankfully, with the help of taxpayers and FEMA dollars. She said time.
You don't want to hear that bell again, do you?
I know.
Okay, so I think that the 2017 tax cut law needs to be reformed to put back into our structure of taxes the idea of nudging public action. So, for example, I was able to put some solar panels on my house and get a nice plug-in hybrid and offer it to the community because I was incented by tax relief. And we should be able to be doing that with appropriate resilience measures for getting us prepared for the next floods and hurricanes. So that's the core of it. Federal government's role is to nudge public opinion in a democratic way so that we can build in a responsible way for what the science tells us is necessary to mitigate and then respond.
And Phil, we'll stay with you for this next question and then go to Dr. Zimmerman. What is your single most significant personal or professional accomplishment regarding sea level rise, the environment, energy conservation, or sustainability?
Wow. Okay. The personal or professional would be in the United States Navy. In the Navy, I was blessed to be a National Security Affairs Fellow at Stanford University. I was given a internship on General Colin Powell's Joint Staff in my early part of my career, and then I was responsible for guiding the development of naval strategy for U.S. Naval Forces Europe, which included a big area to include the Arctic, the most of Africa, all of Soviet space. And in those documents, in that life, we knew that sea level rise and climate change is a factor. Naval people know this. They know it because the environment we fly in and we sail in, and we know that because it displaces people. And as Dr. Zimmerman said, we've got bases that are going to the parking lot, and there's a lot of flooding, Norfolk, for example. So those just general, making sure it's in the federal government at the top of my professional career.
Well, mine is relatively simple and may not even, you might not even think of it as a significant contribution to stop all these greenhouse emissions and everything. But in my family and in our clinic and with my patients, I always encourage recycling. Recycling decreases the amount of human contribution to the dumping of all these fossil fuels in the air. It's just, if we recycle something as simple as that, you don't dump more toxic waste into your environment. And you might not think that all these little things matter. They do. Because if you have biodegradable items, they are better for the environment. And if you have more of the methane and the carbon dioxide, it acts like a thermal blanket. It heats up more of the environment and therefore contributes to the warming of the sea levels, or the sea, and thus contributes to the level of the seas. So this simple act that I've implemented both at home and in everything else I do can, in my own little way, contribute to the betterment of and prevention of sea level rise.
Very good. And we'll stay with you for this next question before we go to Phil. And this it's back to that funding issue, which is a recurring. There's a number of questions about that because it's obviously such a huge issue. Where does the money come from, and how it should be spent wisely? The majority of funding from the federal government can only be spent after an area is hit by a disaster. For example, FEMA spends less than 1% of its budget on pre-disaster mitigation, and the Stafford Act provides federal funding only after an area is hit. Would you want to change these policies to encourage more spending to mitigate pre-disaster, and if so, how?
Actually, I would. As I mentioned, there are 18 bases along the coast. If you frame it as a national security issue, I don't think we will encounter a lot of pushback from that, because it is true. Our military readiness depends on our troops being able to get to those bases, and just the flooding of the roads already delays some of our men from deployment. Also, did you know that a lot of them, for example, the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis floods 50 times a year. That's at least once a week. The Naval Support Facility, which is for the Department of Defense, floods 40 times a year. Norfolk, about 10 times a year, but their problem in Norfolk is the men cannot get to the base in time. That is something that affects our national security. So if we frame it that way, I think even the men across the aisle, or the women across the aisle, will agree that this must be a priority, and this should be also implemented into our tax plan.
Well, I don't disagree with anything you just said. However, I caution the overuse of national security for things that are a little bit outside the mainstream. That's what Donald Trump is doing right now, and it's awful. Let me just say that the funding of FEMA, funding will go where the screaming is the loudest, and the squeak of oil gets the grease. And that's why we have so much funding at the tail end for FEMA in recovery rather than mitigation and prevention. So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We got to move in that direction, and back to the construct of science informing public opinion, driving action from the federal government of nudging. Appropriate mitigation is the way to go. So yes, you always want to rebalance and keep rebalance and justify FEMA's allocation.
All right, very nice. Mr. Ed, we'll start with you for this question and then go to Dr. Zimmerman. Would you support legislative efforts at the federal level to acknowledge the physical and economic threat sea level rise poses and to mandate development and implementation of mitigation plans to combat it?
Absolutely. So this is essentially a code issue, I think, and it's normally a code issue born at the local level, but the federal equity is there. The federal equity is there when everybody's taxpayers' money needs to go into flooding and hurricane and tornadoes in the Midwest and just everything. So it's got to be a partnership. There's an ideology sometimes that drives what politicians and governments do. The ideology might be states' rights for everything, or it might be federal government and states don't matter in some cases. But it's always a blend, and it's always a role. So when we are very critical of our incumbent that says, "Hey, let's get rid of the EPA," for example, that is it's an instance where ideology is trumping practical solutions and a layered defense. And we need a layered defense, all governments working together to affect positive outcomes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, I can.
You got me all confused.
Sure. Would you support legislative efforts at the federal level to acknowledge the physical and economic threat sea level rise poses and to mandate development and implementation of mitigation plans to combat it?
Actually, you just saw the film that I saw. Just here in Walton County, you see how many homes and properties are going to be affected. That's going to affect all of us. We are huge. Florida is a peninsula. We have so much coastline, but up and down the northeastern corridor, all the way down to the southeastern corridor, all the way down to Miami and the Keys, we are all going to be affected. Now, it's different on the East Coast. It's different on the West Coast. Actually, here we have lands that are sinking. Over in the West Coast in Alaska, the lands are actually rising. Any plan or any legislation that will address these different issues, I will support, because it is not only a national security issue, it is a big economic issue. I mentioned earlier, they realized from the data that whenever tragedy strikes or hurricanes strikes the area, more than 50% of those businesses that are affected never reopen. Never reopen. That is a big economic impact. We need to address that.
Okay, thank you. I do want to remind everybody we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question and you want to put that on the cards are at the back of the room, and then there's some folks who are collecting those as well, and they'll make their way to me. So we did reserve some time for questions from the audience as well. So I've only gotten one so far, so I'd love to have some more. So thank you. We're going to do a couple of questions that are just to each as individuals. In other words, the other candidate does not get to answer. These were just chosen randomly, and we only have a couple of these. But we'll start with Dr. Zimmerman. The question is, the National Flood Insurance Program currently blocks the ability for an organized retreat meaning pulling back from the shoreline, moving buildings and such. So an organized retreat, as it requires people to rebuild in the same location. How can the National Flood Insurance Program be addressed to ensure sea level rise is accounted for?
I must admit I did not know that it doesn't allow that, but that sounds foolish to me. And we need to address that issue because, as I said, I'm a woman of science. I base everything on data. We do have data that states with the sea level rise, it is foolish to keep on building infrastructure on areas that may not be there 30 years from now. As you very well know, mortgage is usually 30 years. And in 30 years, wherever there is 1 to 2 feet rise, you do not have that property ever again. It will disappear. Now, What we need to do is make sure that we change the rules of the flood insurance program, because it is a problem if we do not address where we build that infrastructure. It is foolish to keep on building on the same land that may not be there again. Once again, prevention and strategic planning is a lot better than trying to recover what has been lost.
Thank you. The next question for Mr. Ayer, and this is actually an audience question, and I'm going to go jump in and use it because it's very similar to one that we already had on our list, and I want to go ahead and defer to the audience and honor the person that submitted this. Is a very good question. So back to the funding issue again, which is always kind of a recurring thing. So many of those who are most vulnerable to flooding and sea level rise are low or middle income. How do you address flooding and sea level rise without placing an unfair financial burden on those people?
By making sure that elected officials have empathy for people. And we aren't driven by ideology so much. We're driven by practical solutions, and we can see the impact on the human and on the family and on the community. So data-driven approaches are great, and they must be there, and it needs to be also part of the data is the human cost, the human migration away from the coast, the human impact. It's the same sort of problem you have with gentrification sometimes, because we're going to see disproportionate people going into high-risk areas, but essentially we're all Americans. We need to make sure that we encourage people to build and live where they can afford, but not leave them out hanging or drowning.
So we're going to go back to a question that's for both of you, but we'll start with Dr. Zimmerman. In what ways do you believe sea level rise is related to human impact on the environment?
Well, as I told you before, there are 4 major reasons that they identified. And one of them is actually dealing with expansion of seawater, added water from ice sheets, all these things. But one of them is what we do to the environment, the burning of fossil fuels. Our reliance too much on fossil fuels that actually create that thermal greenhouse effect, a blanket. Remember, the heat goes back into the environment. And human activities like the decomposition of waste in landfills, we need to have alternative sources of how we deal with things. That's why, to me, recycling is a simple but very big positive effect in the environment. Agriculture, we must know how to deal with our agricultural wastes. Also, how we manage domestic livestock. All of these things contribute to the human waste. But of course, I am always for alternative sources for energy because they are cleaner.
And Phil, that question will go to you as well. Do you need me to restate that?
Yes, please.
In what ways do you believe sea level rise is related to human impact on the environment?
What was sea level rise? Well, it's the carbon issue. It's the carbon issue that we've just been burning too much carbon, and it drives the melting of the ice and the rising of the sea levels. We need to address our carbon economy by looking at by more activity into more development of alternative energy sources. We're the Sunshine State, after all. We ought to be able to have more solar development, better paying jobs go along with solar infrastructure. And a federal role in that is looking at again, paying for a federal infrastructure bill by not digging more debt, but by reforming this 2017 tax law to rebalance it for the middle class, and not a busted theory of trickle-down economics that is not working for the working families and people who need to, all of us that need to look for forward-looking industries like renewable energy.
Very good. And let's start this next question with Dr. Zimmerman, and this again will be to both of you. And let's do this, and Mary, if you're able to adjust just a little bit, we're going to give them a little bit. This is a pretty broad, pretty expansive question, so we'll give them up to 2 minutes each. You don't have to take it off. You can do it in less, right? But we'll be up to 2 minutes because there's a lot going on here. So again, we'll start with Dr. Zimmerman. At the national level, how do you think the U.S. should address the root causes of sea level rise and warming? Are there specific solutions, such as international agreements, carbon fee and dividends, innovation, technology incentives, or other measures that you would champion?
Once again, I was quite disappointed that we had pulled out of the Paris Accord. I believe that the solution is not very simple. We need our allies. We need the whole world to come together. After all, a lot of this greenhouse effect accelerated, the increase in CO2 accelerated with the industrialization of the world. And the last 20 years, it has gotten worse. And as I was mentioning, we know what causes the sea level to rise. Two of the most important things that we know would be the burning of the fossil fuels. We are too dependent on coal and oil. Coal and oil, when they're burned, increases the carbon dioxide emission. What does that do? Stronger greenhouse effect. It will warm the oceans, and then if the oceans are warm, continually melt the ice sheets. The ice sheets melt. Now we have more water again in the ocean. And there's also another contributing factor that we haven't discussed, the Gulf Stream effect. If you're not aware of that one, that's the one that's like a conveyor belt that kind of recycles this water from the north to the south, the north to the south, and all over the Arctic and all of the other parts of the world. That is why the Paris Accord is very important. We cannot deal with climate change without the help of our allies all over the world, because this will affect all of us. We all have industrialization. What are they doing in the other countries? They have wind and solar. I am for making sure that we have funding for alternative sources. Yes, that is one of my, I will support legislation. I don't know what happened. Why did we pull out? We are so embedded in the coal and oil industry, and we know why. But we can, with a change in Congress, with the change in the makeup, affect the legislation that comes out, and we can once again participate in a global effort to decrease greenhouse emissions.
Sure. At the national level, how do you think the U.S. should address the root causes of sea level rise and warming? Are there specific solutions, such as international agreements, carbon fee and dividends, innovation, technology incentives, or other measures that you would champion?
Okay, so the Paris answer is the obvious answer, and it's the right answer. We need to get back into these voluntary agreements and hold each other countries holding each other accountable through through the normal diplomatic means. Thank God for California. Now, where would we be without California standards being a little bit leading in the nation? Now, I heard a Republican gubernatorial candidate just trash California and say, I'm for Florida and nothing out there is good for us. Well, guess what? California has a role to play, and they always had a good role to play in our national life. And we in Florida can do some leading as well by stepping up again for federal help in helping the state government take advantage of our sunshine and draw attention to the problems that are going to hit us first down in the south part of the state, on the coastal areas around here. And so the federal government, again, has a role. To answer your question, though, specifically, it's that climate change is building in these the carbon economy into structures like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Should we go back into that kind of? We're going to need to do something with the economy in the West that we've withdrawn from, and into NAFTA. Those types of new realities in life need to be factored into our overall trade internationally, and again, to just make sure that we're have these laboratories of innovation by the states, and again, thank goodness for California emission controls and standards.
So to keep on schedule here, we're going to go to one more question here, and then that'll be the wrap up of this first segment here with both of you. This next question, let's do 1 minute on each of those. Yep. Thank you for reminding me.
Bill and I are just having fun.
I know. We're really just getting going, so we could do this all night, right? So this question actually this is a question from the audience, and it's a little bit off from what we're focused on, but I think we can make it stay focused if you both will agree to stay on target. It is a question about campaign finance reform, and I think I would ask you to answer the question in the context of sea level rise and climate change and the fossil fuels that are the primary cause of that, as you both have discussed. And so let me go ahead and ask you the question and ask you to answer it in that context to try to stay attached to that in some way. So do you believe we need campaign finance reform? And if so, what measures would you support? And I guess we will ask Phil to start with that, since we ended with you before.
Okay, campaign finance reform and energy and climate. Okay, good. How about the answer is yes, and the good Lord put us on the earth as people, not corporations, so the people ought to be the drivers of electoral processes, not corporations. So I'm for efforts, perhaps a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. I would also think that the democratic ideal in a democratic republic that we have is indeed a one-person, one adult, one vote model that needs to make sure that people of lesser means, people who are in flood zones, and people who are forced, as you brought out in a previous question, disproportionately affected, they still have the same amount of influence as an individual in the electoral process.
As I had earlier mentioned, one of the drivers of increased carbon dioxide in the air is coal and oil. And we very well know that if they are allowed, those industries are allowed to control our elections, you can forget about any of these changes we are even talking about. Yes, I am for campaign finance reform. Actually, I'm trying to run my campaign as a grassroots effort, and so far it's surviving by the tail or by the fingernails, but it is happening because we know that we are delivering a message that is consistent, that you do not let money drive whatever you do. It is necessary, I'm not going to lie, it is necessary to buy all these materials, but money should not be the driver in your decision, and neither should super PACs be allowed to control what these legislators can do, because this is exactly why even the solar panels now and solar energy has been shot down, because our present administration does not believe, because probably he did not get a big donation from them, but he did from oil and coal.
We had to hear that one more time. I love that. So thank you both very much, Dr. Jennifer Zimmerman, Phil Ayer. That concludes our segment here with the Congressional District 1 candidates, and we're going to